All right, it is 7 o'clock, and I have a lot of information to cover. 6 o'clock, thank you. It is 6 o'clock, and I have a lot of information to cover, so let's get started. First of all, a little bit of introduction. My name is Scott Clark. I am one of the staff here in our Public Services Department, and before it was called that, I was also one of the staff in the Reference Department. And amongst the staff in the Reference Department, we began a project of archiving a lot of materials about one of Lincoln's most notorious news stories, the Charles Starkweather murder spree from 1957 and 58. Amongst the things that we have available are a newspaper clipping collection, which is basically every newspaper clipping that we have been able to identify from the Lincoln papers, some from the Omaha, and a few from other outlying newspapers as well. Almost all, laminated for protection. The main reason that they are laminated is because the microfilm from that time period, usually microfilm would come on the average about a month per reel. And the reels covering that case became so fragile from such heavy use of people coming in and wanting to look up stories that we ended up purchasing a specialized reel, which was just the Starkweather materials, which got added to our reference collection. And that has gotten such heavy use that it is also fragile and brittle and could easily break. So instead of trying to convince people to come and sit on our microfilm machines, we printed them all out and laminated them to keep them in good shape over time. So anytime you want to, you can come, leave a form of ID with us at the staff desk, and we will get the Starkweather box and the slightly smaller Fugate file. And you're more than welcome to do research on them. Within the box and the file, you will find a index telling you exactly what is in each of those things in chronological order. When you look in the box, you will discover they're not in chronological order because anybody that uses it just shuffles them up and does whatever they want. But that way, if you're going to do a long-term research project and take it to a table, you'll have a checklist of what is in there in chronological order. We are constantly adding new articles, so in the process of prepping for this particular talk, just recently I have found 4 additional articles we did not previously have and have laminated them. They'll be added to those lists very shortly. A lot of people ask us, what can we do on your website to do the research? These are not digitized. These are physical copies. We do not have the rights at this point to try to digitize them and make them a digital collection for research purposes. However, the indexes and a timeline, which is fairly detailed, of the events associated with this case are available as printable files from our library website. If you go to the link on the little half-sheet handout that you all found on your seats, you will find a list of all the books in the library's collection that are either circulating or reference materials that can't be checked out, plus all the other materials such as the clippings file. Amongst those, you will find hot links to PDFs of the indexes and to the timeline. So if you'd like something to start with, that's a place that you can print out your own copies of those before you come in to do additional research. You may ask, and people have asked, why revisit something like this, which is one of the most horrific chapters in Lincoln history? And that's a legitimate question. Our new library director, who began with us in December, when we were plotting out what special programs we could do for our summer reading, the June, July, and August period, asked us, because he was new to Lincoln, he came to us from Kalamazoo, is that correct? And he didn't know that much about Lincoln and its history. He said, could you try to slot in some stuff on Lincoln history? And so we've had 4 programs this summer on elements of Lincoln history. This is the 4th and last of them. If you like that idea, tell us. We'll look into doing more programs in the future. But right now, this is the last of our summer Lincoln history series. So with that in mind, I have a script that I'm going to try to follow, but we also may jump around a little bit in terms of my notes. I was asked, how long did it take you to prep this? This took more time than I anticipated. We've got tons of information, but how do you condense it down into an hour-long talk while still allowing for a half an hour, hopefully at the end, for people to share their memories? I will ask, my wife, Becky, who works at our Walt branch, is one of the previous staff to have worked on this. This is a collaborative box. This box involves staff's participation from the 1950s to today. and Rayma over here as well, also worked in our reference department. So both of them were involved in helping to pull clips. Becky did a large number of the laminations and stuff like that, and I've continued in her stead since then. The reason why we have all of this is one of the most researched topics at the Lincoln City Libraries. When people come to us wanting to do research on topics, we get more requests for people who are researching the Starkweather case than almost any other individual single topic that is available for.
School assignments, some of them.
A lot of them may be school assignments, yeah, but we've gotten people from all over the world. We were just talking about a gentleman from England who came here to do a lot of research because he was trying to write a Starkweather book. We don't know if that book ever got published or not, but we've had people from at least a dozen different states come to do research. We obviously can't point them to a big digital archive of stuff, but we've had people have filming sessions down in our Heritage Room of Nebraska authors where several of these materials are, because that's the last copy we have of their particular book. I have had multiple people over the years, setting up tripods with a camera, pointing over their shoulder at the microfilm reader machine because they didn't want to deal with our pre-printed stuff, and scrolling through and taking pictures of every single Starkweather thing that we have. So people are really absolutely fascinated by this topic. It was a seminal moment in Lincoln's history that had an impact nationwide. Somebody asked me to open up our discussion before I launch into my script by asking, the events of this took place in 1957, 58, and 59, and then there have been ripples ever since then. How many people resided in Lincoln during that time period? So a handful. Okay. You may or may not have memories to share at the end of this. I'll open it up for that after we're through this. But I am going to go through a timeline of the case, and then the last third of this slideshow talks about each of these individual resources that are available to you if you wish to do your own additional reading on the topic, and I'll give you some background on what the focus of that particular book is. So with that in mind, I'm going to hold off any questions people might have until the very end, unless there's something absolutely urgent that you want to bring up during the middle. But so we talked about the inspiration for doing this. With that in mind, this case, which began in December 1957, most of the events were January 1958, and then the trials were later in 1958, became known as the Charles Starkweather murder spree. The long-lasting impact they've had on the residents of this city has been almost immeasurable. Because we have one of the largest archives of research materials on this topic, we suggested this subject to our administration as the topic of one of our Lincoln history programs, and it was approved. Here's some background. Oops. Which is it? This switch? Yep, there we go. This hopefully will make it easier for you to see the slides, even though it makes it more difficult for me to read my script. So here we go. Some noteworthy Lincoln facts from 1958, when the majority of these events took place. The 1960 census shows Lincoln's population at slightly over 128,500. This is a library program. Let's tell you something about the libraries at that time. How many of those branches do you recognize? We only still have, we don't call it Maine anymore. In fact, at that time, Maine was a Carnegie Library, which got torn down, and Bennett Martin, which we're sitting in, was built in its place. We still have the Bethany branch, and we still have the South branch. Many of the other buildings still exist, but are no longer libraries. So 1958 to now, that's a lot of changes for the Lincoln City Library. Leaders of our community. Bennett Martin was the mayor at the time that this took place. We're in his building. Victor Anderson was governor of Nebraska in that time period. One of our libraries is named after him. Joe Carroll was the chief of police from 41 to 75. And Merle Carnop was the Lancaster County sheriff from 1951 to 1975, or 79. If you look at this map, which comes from our map archive downstairs, if you ignore the yellow and the green, which are subsequent to this case, all the other colored sections are what was Lincoln at that time, and you can see what the expansion by the late 60s was. But most of the material, or most of the events in this took place right here in the core of Lincoln. Most folks got their news from the newspapers. Lincoln had the Lincoln Star in the morning, the Lincoln Evening Journal in the evening. The Omaha World Herald was the main newspaper for Omaha. Radio. Lincoln had 3 radio stations. KLMS was relatively new at that point, but KFOR and KLAN had both been around a while. TV, KOLN was the only station based out of Lincoln. It had started as a DuPont network affiliate, had been an ABC affiliate briefly, and just before the events of this case, it had become a CBS affiliate. Here's some things going on in the popular culture in the 1958 time period. Top films during the weeks of this case were Pal Joey and Sayonara. Top music, At the Hop, Great Balls of Fire, and Peggy Sue. The #1 books during the weeks that this aired, or the weeks these events took place, By Love Possessed and Anatomy of a Murder, which I find to be ironic titles under the circumstances. And television was the era of the Western on television. They dominated, and Wagon Train was the #2 show, and #1 was Gunsmoke. Charles Starkweather was obsessed with Westerns. He was obsessed with 2 different things. He was obsessed with James Dean, upon whom, based on a variety of different reasons, but he based his look upon James Dean. He basically tried to follow the clothing style, the hairstyle that James Dean had, and in fact, friends and relatives would say he would pose in front of a mirror, striking poses just like James Dean did in James Dean's movies. But in addition to that, he was also obsessed with Westerns, and not the good guys, not the sheriffs and the deputies, but the bad guys. And he would practice his quick draw in front of the mirrors as well. The crimes. I used a template for these slides, which allowed me to slide in the headlines from some of our articles. We're not going to actually look at those specific articles, but be aware, if you want to see the article in its entirety, they're in that box. All right, 1957. This is the northwest part of Lincoln, the Belmont neighborhood. Right there, this is Cornhusker Highway coming here and continuing up this direction. And here's Belmont. That is where there was a Crest gas station. The first crime, not yet known to be something like Charlie Starkweather, took place when the overnight teller and serviceman at the Crest gas station disappeared, and his body was later found. His name was Robert Colvert. He was 21. He was just out of the Navy and had taken this job 2 weeks before he died. The person that he had replaced had recently quit to move on to some other job, but had recommended Robert Colvert, and so he took the job, and he was the overnight guy. So basically, from sundown until the early hours of the morning, he was. This is a service station that had service from a guy there, even in the 1950s. During those kinds of hours, he was the one covering that. I'll have a little bit more details about what happened farther into the talk, but suffice it to say, he, without knowing who had done it, he disappeared from the gas station, and his body was found. If you follow Cornhusker to North 27th Street, follow North 27th Street, this is Superior. This is where Lincoln Crossing is right now, and the Walmart and all that kind of stuff. His body was ultimately found at approximately 30th and Superior Street. It was basically a rundown dirt road. There were businesses staggered occasionally along that space, but it was not a well-traveled area. Ironically, in reading some of these books, I discovered how many of you have heard of the tale of Bloody Mary here in Lincoln. Mary Partington. Well, her house, where the Bloody Mary story takes place, is right over here. That circle shows you the street where the Bartlett home is, which is where our next actions are going to take place, only about 5 blocks from the Crest station. This, I do need my script for. Charlie and Carol, or Carol and Charlie. In January 1958, Carol Ann Puget was a 14-year-old student at Whittier Junior High School, living in the Belmont neighborhood of Northwest Lincoln with her mother, Velda Bartlett, 36 years old, and her stepfather, Marion Bartlett, 57 years old. Also living with them was Betty Jean, Velda and Marion's 2.5-year-old daughter. Carol's older sister, Barbara, had already married at a very young age, at only 16, and lived elsewhere in Lincoln with her husband, Bob Von Bush. In fact, before they married, Bob and Barbara introduced Carol Ann, Barbara's younger sister, to one of Bob's friends, Charlie Starkweather. The couples frequently double dated. Carol was an unexceptional student, neither good nor bad, with only a few close friends, including the girl she walked to the school bus stop with each day. Charlie, who Carol called Chuck, was born with the birth defect genu varum, which caused him to be notably bow-legged and walk with an exaggerated gait. He also had a lisp, which in his early years made it hard for him to pronounce W and R sounds. He also suffered from undiagnosed myopia, is that how you pronounce it?
Yes.
Nearsightedness. Basically, that meant it was difficult for him to see items in the distance. This was undiagnosed during most of his school years, and therefore he suffered in his schooling because he couldn't see what was on the chalkboard. And so for years, he was looked upon as a fairly dumb guy, whereas in certain cases, especially his civics classes, he excelled. But when it came to being called upon to do something associated with going up to what had just been written on the board, he kept having problems. Though this was later improved with glasses, Charlie's school years were difficult. In his later prison writings and interviews with the psychologist Dr. James Reinhardt, Charlie said he was bullied and teased as a child, although interviews with his teachers and school officials could not support this claim. Charlie did excel at physical tasks, such as gym class, and he trained himself to fight back against the bullies, although that left him with few friends. One of those friends was Bob Von Bush, who basically challenged Charlie when he moved into a new school, and they had this dust-up that left them both bloody, but they both respected each other immediately because of this, and they became good friends after that. Charlie seemed somewhat aimless, having left school at age 16 to go to work. First as a garbage man, then at the Western Newspaper Union baling paper, and then again, after he got left that job, shortly before he was going to be fired from it, he became a garbage man again, this time doing routes with his brother Rodney in the country club area of Lincoln. At 19, Charlie was 5 years older than Carol, but she appeared and often acted older than her actual age. By January 1958, Carol and Charlie were a couple and had been seeing each other for close to a year and a half. Charlie and his father, Guy, had co-signed on a car, which Charlie used to teach Carol how to drive. However, while doing that, at one point Carol had the car by herself and was in an accident, leading to an argument between Guy and Charlie over the insurance and the responsibility for the vehicle, which resulted in Charlie being kicked out of the Starkweather family home. He eventually ended up in an apartment on North 10th Street, which we'll see in one of the later slides. Charlie had vivid dreams of meeting death in the form of a part human, part bear-like creature. Felt that his life was on a downward spiral and told others that the only positive thing in his life was Carol. He felt that he was on a path towards a shortened life, but he didn't mind as much because he believed Carol was going to be with him to the very end. Just a few days before this murder spree began, following several arguments and with the support of her parents who disliked Charlie intensely, Carol had told Charlie she didn't want to see him again and he shouldn't come around to the Bartlett home anymore. Carol's parents intensely disapproved of him. She had put on weight and was rumored, sometimes by Charlie's insisting the rumors get spread around, that she had become impregnated. She hadn't, but the family was very upset with him under the circumstances. Charles, born November 24th, 38. Carol, born July 30th, 1943. First introduced before a double date in late 56 or early 57, at the time that they had both been captured after the crime spree, and she was being interviewed. People were asking how long had they been together. She said about a year and a half. January 21st. Here's a map of Lincoln from 1950, I believe 56. Here is a map closed in on the Belmont neighborhood. Here is the street, 924 Belmont, where the Bartlett house was. Here is how close to that house, that gas station where the service attendant was killed was. That is how close Charlie's apartment was. And over here near Woods Park is where the Starkweather family home was. Reminding you of the location. And I need my script again. In the early part of January 21st, once again locked out of his own apartment for lack of payment, Charles Starkweather borrowed his brother's .22 caliber rifle, claiming that he and Marion Bartlett were going to going hunting, despite the fact that other people knew that he had been told not to come back to the Bartlett home. When he got to the Bartlett home, he got into an argument with Velda and then with Marion and was kicked out of the house. He went to the nearby grocery store. This actually happened twice. He was kicked out once, he came back. He was literally kicked in the butt by Marion out of the house. And immediately after that, Charlie walked to the nearby grocery store, called Marion's place of employment. The Bartletts did not have a phone of their own. Called Marion's place of employment and told them that Marion was sick and would not be in for several days. One of the secretarial staff had already run into Marion earlier that day at a grocery store and reported that Marion seemed fine at the time. Returning to the Bartlett home to reclaim his gun, which he had left there, Charlie once again got into an argument with Velda, who slapped him. Further altercations occurred, and then Charlie loaded a shell into the gun. Marion came at him with a hammer. Charlie shot him in the head. Velda came at Charlie with a butcher knife. He shot her. Neither of them was completely killed from these actions. Velda crawled to where the 2.5-year-old baby or small child, Betty Jean, was and was trying to protect her. Charlie basically hit her with the butt of the gun repeatedly until Velda stopped moving. The child started screaming. Charlie hit the child with the butt of the gun until the butt of the gun broke. He then stabbed Marion with a kitchen knife in the throat because he was still moving. He then proceeded, as far as evidence would seem to indicate, he proceeded to conceal those 3 bodies, one in an outhouse in the back of the property and one in an abandoned chicken coop on the back of the property. This was January, freezing cold temperatures. He wrapped the Marion's body in a rug and various rags, and he wrapped Velda's body in a variety of different things, including some newspapers. He went so far as to try to stuff Velda down into the toilet of the outhouse and left the baby in a cardboard box. A couple of hours later, Carol arrives home from school. The reason the timeline is important is because Charlie, over the years or over the months of investigating, changed his story repeatedly, and eventually at one point or another said that Carol was part of this and was there when the killings took place. However, there were multiple gunshots, and none of the neighbors heard anything who had arrived home before Carol did. So it's unlikely that those changes in his story were accurate. This took place for 6 days. The 2 teenagers, first of all, when she walked in the door, Charlie supposedly held a gun on her and told her that her family had been kidnapped, that he was part of a gang that was planning to do a robbery, and his accomplices were going to be holding the 2 adults and the child, and that Carol was to do whatever he told her to do in the meantime. She initially didn't believe him, but when the rest of the family didn't show up later that day, and days kept going, she eventually decided to follow along with what his instructions were. Multiple visits occurred. The milkman stopped to drop off milk, and she took it. The little girl that would walk with her to the bus stop stopped by, and she said, "I'm sick. I got the flu. I'm not going to be able to go into work." After a few days, the sister and brother-in-law, Carol Ann's sister, and her husband, who had had a recent baby, and Velda had photographs that she had just had developed and was looking forward to showing to the rest of the family, stopped by, and Carol Ann behaved very strangely at the door, would not let them in, blocked the door from being open, and said, "You need to leave. We all are sick. We're sick. Everybody here is sick." She didn't actually say she herself was sick. "Everybody here is sick. You need to leave." When her sister Barbara tried to force her way in, she got frantic, saying, "Mom's going to be hurt if you don't go away. Leave now or Mom is going to be hurt." Didn't explain why or how somebody that's sick is going to be hurt, but this happened several times. Other people stopped by. Charlie's brother, Rodney, stopped by with the husband of Barbara. They both tried to come in on the excuse of having a bill that they needed to settle with Marion, and still were not let in. They went to the police, asked the police to come and find out why it is that we're not being let into this house. And after badgering the police, 2 officers did go out, had an interview with Carol at the front door while the 2 relatives sat in the car a block away watching to see what would happen. And the police were satisfied with her answer that, yeah, everybody has the flu. Well, we don't get along with our relatives that well, so that's why we didn't let them in. And the police said to the guy, stop bothering us, go away, don't do this again. Finally, the grandmother, Pansy Street, Velda's mother, insisted. She stopped by, took a taxi, came to the front door, pound, you're gonna let me in. When Carol entered the door, she stood there and was gesturing behind her while saying, you can't come in, no, everybody's sick in here. Pansy didn't understand what the gesture meant, and after yelling, Velda, at least come let me see you from across the room, and not getting any response, she left and she said, I'm going to the police to get a warrant to be entered into this building. At which point, Charlie and Carol left. It was several hours later that Pansy was able to convince the officers to come. They came, found the place. Nobody answered the knock on the door. The doors were locked. Pansy said, you need to break in for me. So they went around, found one window that was unlocked. The officer crawled in, walked to the inside door, let everybody in. They looked around, found no evidence of anything going on. If you look, I do not have photos in the slideshow, but if you look at photos that are available, the place was a pigsty. It was filthy. You might not have been able to tell that there were violent crimes that had taken place in there. And in fact, as you look at the debris out in the yard and stuff, that's just a smidgen of what was going on inside the house. So the cops took Grandma back to her apartment and said, stop messing around in the lives of your married kids if they don't want you there, and that was it. Well, later that same day, Bob and Rodney decided something's still not right, and they went back and they found all the windows and doors locked. And they said, well, I don't think the police checked these outbuildings, let's check them, and they found the body. That immediately set up red flags. The police came back, and an all-point bulletin went out for Charlie Starkweather because they knew that there was a bad relationship between him and the families. One of the last and most interesting notes is that late in this, on the back of a piece of yellow receipt paper, they found taped up in the window of the main front door this note that said, stay away, everybody is sick with the flu, Miss Bartlett, multiple underlines under Miss Bartlett. Carol Ann's, in her testimony, indicates that she wrote that note. She put Miss Bartlett underlined because there was no Miss Bartlett unless you count the 2.5-year-old child who certainly could not write this note. She said that this was supposed to be a clue to anybody that something is not right here. And so that was a piece of evidence. So, the victims were Velda, Marion, and Betty Jean Bartlett. Charlie and Carol drove off. Oh, we have a moth or something. Yay. Charlie and Carol drove off rapidly in Charlie's car, which had lots of problems. They stopped at a gas station not too far away near where 13th crosses Highway 2 right now, or the old Highway 2, to have his transmission packed. And while the car was raised up on a lift so the transmission could be worked on, Carol Ann insists that she wrote a note at that time that said, let me see if I can get the wording here. Help, police, don't ignore, and stuffed it in her coat pocket, hoping that there would be an opportunity for her to pass that on to somebody. She did not want to endanger the lives of her family, who Charlie kept supposedly threatening to convince her to go along, but she also was very concerned and wanted to pass that note along. It is telling that she never did pass that note along. If you look at most of the trial transcripts, that note is never even mentioned. However, if you look at the news coverage, when she was finally in the safety of law officers in Wyoming, that note was found. It was identified. Law officers recognized that the note had been in her coat pocket, and they sent it to the prosecuting attorneys in Lincoln, and it disappeared and was never seen again. So most of our action thus far, after Carol and Charlie have ended up at a gas station having the transmission packed, they continued to drive. They were heading down Highway 77 towards Beatrice. They realized that Charlie had a tire that was going bad, so they stopped at a gas station near 77th or Highway 77 and Saltillo Road. I don't know if the gas station that is there right now is at the same location where that was, but there is a gas station at that intersection. Charlie had the clerk there working on replacing his tire and sent Carol Ann into the attached cafe with money to get some burgers because they were going to need some food. Carol Ann and warned her, don't say anything. And Carol Ann went in, placed an order for food, sat there at the counter, and the waitress in there later reported that Carol Ann behaved very strangely and stared intensely at her the entire time she was in the restaurant, as if she wanted to say something but wasn't going to say anything. Finally, Charlie came in to find out what was going on. The hamburgers were done. They paid and got out, and the waitress said she saw a spat between the two of them out by the car before they got in the car and drove away. After eating, Charlie decided, I have a family friend who lives up near Bennett, Nebraska, on a farm that allows the Starkweather family to come and hunt on his grounds. We're going to go there. That would be a place where we can hide out for the time being. We might even be able to get some help from August Meyer. So, our actions move from Lincoln to the Bennett area. They eventually arrived at August Meyer's rural home, but Charlie got his car stuck in the muddy, unpaved driveway, which was nearly a mile long up to Meyer's house off of the road. They approached Meyer's house, first taking shelter in a nearby storm cellar for half an hour before realizing it was too cold to remain outdoors, and then walking to Meyer's house. That storm cellar was all that was left of a county school, District 76 county school. The rest of the above ground portion of the building had been torn down recently, but the underground portion, which still had doors covering a storm cellar, remained, but it was unlit. It was on no electricity, anything whatsoever. Very uncomfortable place, but it comes into play very shortly after this. They walk up to Meyer's house, insisting when Meyer comes out of his house to find out what's going on and recognizes Charlie, that they need Meyer's horse to help pull the car out of the mud. Meyer reluctantly agreed, returning to his house briefly, coming back with his coat and his own rifle. That apparently freaked out Charlie, because as they walked towards the animal shed where the horse was, Charlie shot him in the back of the head without any provocation whatsoever. When Meyer's back was turned and they did, I'm sorry, I covered that. Then Meyer's dog started barking and coming at Charlie, so Charlie hit the dog with the butt of the rifle, and it went running off into the wilderness. He passed, actually, the gun that he was using to hit the dog got damaged. He gave that gun to Carol to hold, who stood by it in shock at that point, because if we are to believe Carol's statements, she had not thus far seen anybody actually get killed. This was the first violence that she had seen. Charlie dragged Meyer's body to a nearby wash house. Then both youth entered Meyer's home. Charlie ransacked it for food, money, and supplies. He had always heard that Meyer had kept hundreds of dollars hidden because he didn't trust the banks, but all he found was about $100 and some food. He did, however, take Meyer's gun and another handgun that he found in the house, but there were no bullets for the handgun, only bullets for the rifle. Returning to Charlie's stuck car, they were approached by a local who happened to be driving by, Howard Ganucci, who offered to help pull them out of the mud, which he did, and then left. In fact, Charlie asked, how much do I owe you? And the guy said nothing, and Charlie gave him a couple bucks. Panicking because he thought someone had seen Meyer's body, they peeked in the shed where he had covered him up with a white blanket. The blanket had come off of the body, so Charlie thought somebody was out there and had seen it. They left in a rush. They drove toward Lincoln for about 10 minutes before Charlie decided he had overreacted, and they headed back to Meyer's, where they proceeded to get stuck in the mud again. Carrying multiple guns, Charlie and Carol started walking down the country road and were seen by two teenagers driving by, Robert Jenkins, age 17, and his girlfriend Carol King, age 16, who were out running errands. Offering Charlie and Carol a ride, Jenkins first tried to ask them to put the guns in the front seat. Charlie said they weren't loaded, so Jenkins didn't make an issue of it. Charlie asked to be taken to a payphone, but the closest, in Bennett, was not available due to the business that it was located in being closed at the time. They got there. Jenkins volunteered to drive them to his own home to use the Jenkins family phone, but Charlie placed his gun on Jenkins and told him to drive them to Lincoln. Jenkins initially thought it was a joke, but Charlie insisted that it was not and that he would shoot the girl, Carol King, if Jenkins did not cooperate. After they started driving, Charlie changed his mind, told Jenkins to turn around and go back to the Myers property. He had thought of the idea, supposedly, according to various versions of the testimony, of having the two teenagers go down into that cellar and then blocking the doors to the cellar. At least that's what he said he was going to do. So they drove back and parked near the District 79 schoolhouse grounds. Charlie said he was going to lock the two teenagers up and take their car. Jenkins even tried to warn Charlie about some of the issues the car had. During this drive, the topic of whether or not Robert Jenkins had any money on him came up, and Jenkins and Charlie both passed Carol Ann their wallets. Carol Ann removed $4 from Jenkins' wallet, put it in Charlie's wallet, and gave the wallets back to the respective gentlemen, a critical point for the trials later. They got back to near where the cellar was, parked. Charlie forced Jenkins, told both of the captives to get out of the car, forced Jenkins out at gunpoint. The girl stayed frozen in the front seat. Carol, who happened to be carrying a backup rifle that was damaged, pointed it at her and said, "You better get out, that's what he wants you to do." And so Carol got out of the car. Well, that's confusing. Carol, C-A-R-I-L, Carol Ann, stayed in the car. Carol King got out of the car. Charlie took both of the teenagers to the entrance to the cellar, and then you have multiple different stories as to exactly what happened in what order, depending on which version of Charlie Starkweather's story you want to follow. But in general, the gist of it appears to be that he told Robert Jenkins Jr. to go down the stairs, and while he was on his way down, Charlie says he started back up at him. Charlie believes and testified during the court trials that all of his killings were in self-defense. All of them, including a 2.5-year-old baby. Nonetheless, the gunshot wounds to Robert Jenkins are to the back of his head, and he shot him 6 times. Charlie had a hair trigger that when he started something, friends and relatives who went hunting with him said he'd shoot an animal and then he'd empty all the bullets into that animal after it was down. So he did the same thing with Robert Jenkins. The body of Carol King was also found on top of Robert Jenkins' body later, half stripped, pants down around her ankles. The presumption, based on the physical evidence, despite what Charlie says, is that he told her to strip down and wanted to try to sexually molest her, but it was freezing cold and Charlie couldn't do it because of the temperatures. So he shot her and left both bodies at the bottom, came back, told Carol Ann in the car that he had only shot the guy. They managed to get Jenkins' car going up the road, and they took off. Not long after that, people were looking for the missing 2 teenagers, and they were still looking all around the Lincoln area for Charlie's car, and all of that came in conjunction with each other, and somebody reported that they saw Charlie's car mired in mud in the driveway of August Myers' house. All law enforcement in the Lincoln area, Bennett area, even as far as Omaha, came and surrounded that house, thinking that Charlie was inside because this car was still inside. In fact, they surrounded it, yelled out over bullhorns, "You have 5 minutes to surrender or we're coming in after you." Nothing happened, obviously. They fired tear gas canisters through every single window of the house, waited for it to dissipate so they could go in, so all these law guys have their handkerchiefs up. One of the law guys happens to be walking by the shed and sees the body of August Meyer. That's reported. They finally get inside the house, discover nothing. While this is all going on, lots of people from Bennett have heard about it and have also come to surround the line of the police with their own guns, vigilantes. And also, this has made the news wire. There was a trade agreement for a lot of law enforcement that when they went out on a call that was likely to involve something, they called the press so that the press could come and cover it. So there were multiple press people here, and one of them was standing at the back of the crowd when a neighbor farmer came up and asked the reporter, is there a police officer I can talk to here? And the guy seemed super concerned about something, and the reporter said, well, all of you guys are police, but here's one, and he pointed to a nearby one, and he followed the guy so he could listen to the conversation. And the conversation was that farmer overnight had heard gunshots and then a car racing away from the entrance to the cellar. So he went on a hunch to this cellar and looked down and found the bodies. Charlie and Carol are on the run. Our latest victims are August Meyer, age 70, Robert Benson, and Carol. Charlie and Carol head back into Lincoln. Ironically, they decide to drive in this car that's not going to be recognized because it's not Charlie's car. They drive right by the Bartlett house to just check and see what's going on. There's police there. They continue driving. They decide Charlie has a brother living out in Washington State. They're going to drive out there. They can hide out in Washington State. So they start heading down the highway. This is before Interstate 80, keep in mind. They get as far as Hastings. Charlie's super tired. They stop at a resort gas station in Hastings, and Charlie makes the decision, we need a different car than this one. This one, the Jenkins kid told me it had a problem. Well, it does. It's not going to make a long trip. We need to go back and get another car. They're not going to expect us coming back into Lincoln from the west-hand side. It's going to be safe for us to do that, so they drive back into Lincoln. And because he's familiar with the country club neighborhood, having picked up their garbage for a couple of years, he knows that there's places there that they could probably get a good car. So they park at the corner of 24th and Van Dorn and sleep overnight in the freezing cold in the car, and then watch the house of C. Lauer Ward and his wife Clara until C. Lauer leaves in the morning. He knows this guy's got stuff. He's one of the biggest industrialists in Lincoln, head of Capital Bridge and Capital Metal. So he's involved in all sorts of government stuff. He's a personal friend of Governor Victor Anderson. So they wait until he leaves the house. They pull into the long sloping driveway and hide the car sort of behind the house. And Charlie says to Carol, stay in the car. I'm going to go in and see if everything's safe. And he does. And he comes back out not too long after that and brings Carol in. They had a maid, Lillian Finkel, who was deaf, or at least mostly deaf. But Charlie had written out notes telling her, follow my instructions and nobody gets hurt. Put this dog outside, and the maid puts her in the bathroom. Mrs. Ward had not even come down yet. So they're all sitting there with guns in when Mrs. Ward comes down the stairs in her bathrobe, and Charlie explains that nobody's going to get hurt if you just do what I say. And so both of the women agree to cooperate, and to keep themselves busy, they start cleaning up things on the first floor of the house. Well, Carol goes and takes a nap in the Ward library on a couch. Charlie asks for food, and so Mrs. Ward makes him pancakes. This is how far away the country club area is from the Belmont area where the previous crimes in Lincoln have taken place. This is a composite of two different photos that nicely matched up together to show you the full length of the house from an angle. As the day progresses, the morning paper had been delivered to the front house, the Star. Before the afternoon is done, the Lincoln Journal will be delivered as well. So there are two papers that are covering front page news of this crime spree. At this point, the news had not even made it into the Star morning paper of the killings of Meyer and the two kids from Bennett yet, but the afternoon paper did. The journalists were on top and putting out special editions of the paper every single time something changed. Carol Ann, in her statements, continued to insist that she was unaware that her parents and sister were dead. One question mark as to whether that is accurate or not is that she and Charlie together clipped newspaper articles. Charlie kept most of the paper from her and only gave her sections of the paper that supposedly would not reveal that her parents were dead. Whether that's to be believed, there's only two people that know, and Carol Ann is the only one that's still alive amongst them. During the course of the day, Mrs. Ward at one point finally says to Charlie that she needs to switch to more comfortable shoes if she's going to stay downstairs and continue to work on stuff. Can I go upstairs and change my clothes? And Charlie hems and haws. They had asked earlier if there were any guns in the house, and there was a brief pause before Mrs. Ward said no. And Charlie believed her and let her go upstairs. And he and Carol Ann were doing some of the newspaper clippings when Charlie realized it's been a while since this woman disappeared. So he went to check on her, discovered that she had uncovered a handgun, which she pointed at him when he came into the bedroom and fired, but missed him. So basically she started to run away. One of Charlie's hobbies was knife throwing. In fact, the walls of Carol Ann's bedroom were filled with knife dings from where the blade of the knife would stick in the walls. He threw a knife at Mrs. Ward's back and it stuck and she collapsed, and he threw her on the bed, tied her up. Before the afternoon was done, stabbed her multiple times until she was dead. The maid downstairs didn't hear any of this because she was dead. Before the afternoon was done, however, the maid would also be tied up in another bedroom upstairs. Carol Ann, after her lengthy nap, serves as a lookout for Charlie, for Mr. Ward returning home, and gives a shout out when she sees his car coming up the driveway. Carol Ann supposedly, according to her statements, locked herself in the bathroom so she wouldn't see what happened next to Charlie when Mr. Ward came in. He immediately had a gun on him, but Mr. Ward charged him. There was a battle for the gun. A door to the basement had been left open. They ended up at that door. Mr. Ward fell down the steps to the basement with the gun. Charlie chased him down. They struggled some more. Charlie got the gun. Mr. Ward tried to run up the stairs to get away. Charlie shot him in the back. That didn't kill him, so he ended up stabbing him repeatedly. So there were 3 victims. Charlie later specifies that he didn't do anything to either of the 2 women, so that had to have been Carol Ann. Carol Ann's statements are obviously different. And the physical evidence would seem to indicate that Charlie was inaccurate in that change in his statement. However, they decide they're going to hide the teenager Robert Jenkins' car in the Ward's garage and take the Ward's Packard. They had a choice of a regular sedan or a rich person's car, a Packard, and they decided they're going to take the Packard. Not the brightest move in the world because the Packard is so obviously recognizable, but they do, and they head out. They drive one more time by the Bartlett house in another new car that they're not going to be recognized in. Oh, first of all, before they leave, Charlie takes some of Mr. Ward's shoe polish and puts it throughout his hair. To try to hide his bright red, flaming red hair. His nickname, when the bullies were teasing him, was red-headed, bow-legged woodpecker. So he conceals that. They drive out, they go by the Bartlett house, they realize they're still being looked for even there, so they head out on Highway 2, actually Highway 34, through Seward, and then taking smaller country roads heading towards Washington State again. Meanwhile, at the house, later that afternoon, a relative of Mr. Ward stops by to find out why Mr. Ward hasn't shown up for work. By the way, the last person to see Ward alive, other than the people at this house, Governor Anderson. He had just left a meeting with the governor to talk about how to deal with the repercussions of this whole Starkweather situation. So, anyway, there's their house with the police all over the place, and here is Bennett Martin, the mayor of Lincoln, coming to confer at the Ward house. Latest victims: Seelauer Ward, Clara Ward, and Lillian Franklin. So, all the actions thus far have been taking place in the Lincoln area, right here in Bennett. Now we move across the border of Nebraska and Wyoming into Wyoming and the area around Douglas. They've stopped several times in various communities in Nebraska and eastern Wyoming. Each place, they were not recognized at the time, but people after the fact realized who they were and reported to various newspaper reporters of their interactions, including one place in, I believe it was Broken Bow, where Charlie stopped, asked about maps for Idaho and Washington, was told, well, I can't do that, but I can do Wyoming, and where are you going? And Charlie basically quoted as saying, hell, I guess it really doesn't matter. So they drive through Douglas. They drive past Douglas and are continuing west. Charlie has had the radio on sporadically anytime a story comes on that potentially could tell Carol that her parents are dead. He turns off the radio, but it just happened to be on at one point when they hear an announcement describing the Packard that they're now driving, and that they could be almost anywhere, and people in nearby states should be watching out for them. So Charlie decides they need another car. They happen to drive by one that's been abandoned by the side of the road. Charlie gets out to look at it, discovers there's no keys, and it was probably something where it broke down and somebody walked to get some service, so they get back in the car and keep going, find another car a little farther down the road. Charlie leaves Carol Ann in the car. Charlie goes across the street. It's actually pointing the opposite direction. Sees a guy sleeping on the seat of the car, bangs on the car, doesn't have a gun on him, left the gun in his own Packard, and tells the guy, "We're going to switch cars." And the guy's like, "Yeah, right, we're going to switch cars." "No, we're not." Charlie goes back, gets a gun, points the gun at the guy through the window. The guy still doesn't cooperate, shoots twice through the window, killing Merle Collison. 2 shots. He ended up having 9 bullet holes in him, so he shot him 7 more times after he opened up the door. Just another sign of Charlie and his obsessions. Merle Collison was a shoe salesman, a traveling salesman from Montana, who just got tired and took a nap at the side of the road. While this is happening, however, Charlie decides, okay, we're going to take the dead guy's car, has Carol move all their stuff into the back seat of the dead guy's car, discovers there's an emergency or a handbrake in that car which has been set up by the driver. He can't get it off, so he can't get this car to move, and he's struggling with it with the door open when a guy drives by on the highway, sees Charlie, doesn't see any guns, just thinks, okay, here's a guy that needs some help. Gets out, walks over to the car, says, "Anything I can do to help you?" Charlie turns a gun on him and says, "Yeah, release this handbrake, I'm going to kill you." And the guy starts forward to do it, but lunges for the gun. And they have a struggle that moves into the middle of the highway, and they're struggling back and forth for the gun, and other cars are coming both directions. Cars coming from the far west heading towards Douglas end up pulling to the side of the road because they don't want to get anywhere near this situation. The third car that pulls up is the local deputy sheriff. He pulls to a stop behind the 2 other vehicles, gets out of the car, starts walking forward. Next thing he knows, 14-year-old Carol Ann Fugit is running towards him from the scene of the fight, dodging back and forth as if she's expecting to be shot at any time, and begging him to hide her. He's crazy. He's just killed a man. He's going to try to kill me. And the deputy sheriff is, who? Charlie Starkweather. And so the guy tosses Carol Ann into his car where he had a fellow passenger who's going to keep an eye on him, and starts towards Charlie, who recognizes the uniform of a lawman, breaks off the combat with the guy over the gun, who falls over backwards into the ditch, runs back to the Packard that is at the side of the road, spins around and heads back towards Douglas. Romers has 2 different stories, that he then ran back to his own, Deputy Romers has 2 different stories. One that he ran back to his car, gave chase after Charlie. Another version of the story has it that he just stayed right where he was. Whichever way, he's calling on the radio to ask for a roadblock to be set up at Douglas, gets the local chief of police, who happens to be with his boss, the county sheriff, in the same vehicle, and they agree to do that. So he then goes back to the original crime scene at the side of the road to make sure nothing gets disturbed. Charlie hits the roadblock, goes right around it, and straight into Douglas at 100 miles an hour. When he gets into Douglas, there's enough local traffic that he has to slow down. The sheriff and chief of police come up right behind him, hook bumpers between the 2 cars. Charlie weaves around a block, pulls off his own back bumper, and continues driving out of Douglas the other direction towards Nebraska. They give chase at 120 miles an hour. The one who's not driving the car is shooting and ends up trying to shoot out the tires on the Packard unsuccessfully, ends up shooting the back window of the vehicle. Flying glass nicks Charlie's ear. The Packard goes over a hill ahead of the other one, and when they get to the top of the hill, they discover the Packard stopped in the middle of the road. Charlie getting out, blood coming down his ear and spilling all over his side, and he basically thought he was dying of blood loss because of a minor nick to his ear. So after warning him and then shooting the pavement in front of him, Charlie finally lays down, is cuffed, and says, "You wouldn't have got me if I would have got away if I hadn't stopped." And if I had had a gun with some bullets, I would have killed both of you. So he's still mouthing off. Hole in the back of the package window. His Wyoming mugshot. Carol Ann in a cell in the Wyoming jail. Obviously, news spread like wildfire. All the Lincoln news agencies and newspapers and everything said what was going on to the local populace. The panic that took place in Lincoln began to lessen somewhat. Representatives of law enforcement from Lincoln were sent out to Douglas, Wyoming to bring the two of them back. Neither of the suspects wished to fly, so they ended up in separate cars being driven back, which actually worked in the favor of Elmer Shield, Lancaster County attorney, who drove in the car with Charlie, because he was able to grill Charlie the entire way back and got all sorts of stuff. Charlie's initial statements were, take it easy on the girl, she didn't do anything, it was all me. And he said that several times. Charlie had at least 7 different confessions. Some were written out in great detail, some were very simple. They stopped overnight in Gearing, Nebraska on the way back, and in the jail cell in Gearing, he stood on top of a toilet and with a blunt-nosed pencil wrote on the wall of the Gearing jail cell a cryptic note about the case. That was the first time that there was any evidence that he accused Carol Ann of anything, in which he said, 11 dead, I killed all the men, she killed all the women, which doesn't add up in any way whatsoever with any reality. Basically, before they left Wyoming, Charlie was given the opportunity to sign, both of them were given the opportunity to sign extradition papers saying that they agreed to be taken back to Nebraska, because he had killed somebody in Wyoming. He could have easily been tried in Wyoming for the trial. What he didn't know at the time, even though both states had death penalties, Wyoming used gas chamber and Nebraska used the electric chair. What he didn't know at the time was the current governor in Wyoming did not agree with the death penalty and would have given clemency and commuted any kind of a death execution statement and made it a life sentence if Charlie had been convicted in Wyoming. But Charlie said, I don't like the smell of gas, so let's go back to Nebraska. Carol Ann, one of the turning points of the case, if you look at either of these two case books that take a bias towards Carol Ann in favor of her being a victim in this, is that she was not given any kinds of legal advice, told that she could remain in Wyoming, told that she didn't have to make statements because they could be used against her specifically. She willingly told as much as she possibly could, with the presumption that it was all going to be used against Charlie, only to have it be turned around against her in her own trial later. I realize it is 7 o'clock, which is where we were supposed to open this up to public comment, but I've got more to go. So shall I continue with the documentation of the case? So, they are driving back from eastern Wyoming and the trials. Charlie, his trial began on May 5th and ended on May 23rd. Carol Ann's October 27th to November 21st. No photographs were allowed in either of the trials, so all we have is sketch artists. Pardon me while I catch up on my script. Okay. Trial began for Charlie on May 5th, 1958. The prosecutors were County Attorney Elmer Shield and his deputy, I'll get the next slide up here as well, and his deputy Dale Farnbrook. Prosecution witnesses included Robert Jensen Sr., father of the victim, Warren King, brother of Carol King, Homer Tate, owner of one of the service stations, Howard Schnucci, the farmer who helped them get out of the mud, Everett Browning, the farmer who found the bodies inside the cellar, and Dr. Erwin Zeman, pathologist who conducted the Jensen autopsy. Gogan and Mashalat, the two attorneys for Charlie admitted everything. There was no question he was going to be found guilty. The question was, what level of guilty was it going to be? What kind of punishment could there possibly be for him? And their argument was the only way to save his life is to have him be guilty by reason of insanity. And Charlie absolutely refused this. Charlie's family did not want that blood. They didn't apparently mind having a mass murderer in their family line, but they did mind if he was declared insane. So they didn't cooperate with anything to do with an insane plea. In fact, Charlie admired Elmer Scheel, this guy and this guy right here, so much, the prosecutor who specifically to his face said, "I'm going to do everything I can to see you are killed or executed." He admired him so much for his forthrightness and his manliness that he cooperated with the prosecution more than he cooperated with his own defense attorney. The prosecution, as I said, was those two guys. Let's see. Defense witnesses included Bob Von Bush, Helen Starkweather, Charlie Starkweather himself, Charlie's father Guy, Dr. Nathan Greenbaum, Dr. John O'Hearn, and Dr. John Steinman, three psychiatrists who were brought in to show that Charlie was not in the right state of mind when the crimes were occurred and could not have planned. None of this was a planned crime, that this was all impulse and spur of the moment. The prosecution had their own psychiatrists lined up who had completely different opinions from the exact same interviews that were done to get those results. There is the jury. I believe it was 7 men and 5 women. I might be wrong. It might be 5 men and 7 women. During part of it, when Charlie was being grilled, or when Charlie's attorneys were being grilled about the psychiatric elements, Charlie was seen reading psychiatry textbooks at his table. Otherwise, half the time he was falling asleep during the trial, showing how much attention he was paying to everything. Meanwhile, at the end of his trial, without question, the jury was only gone for, over the course of 2 days, it was only a few hours. They came back with guilty in the first degree, premeditated, and also guilty in while doing a robbery. So the $4 that was stolen from the wallet was a robbery. Obviously, the stealing of the Jenkins car was also a robbery as well, but that $4 was also what was pinned on Carol later, because she took the wallets, took the money, exchanged them, and gave the wallets back. So, anyway, he was. The jury also gave the sentence, which they said was going to be death. Obviously, the judge has to pass that final judgment, which will take place somewhat later. Carol, meanwhile, had no attorneys for the early part of the time after the events happened. Finally, Judge Harry Spencer, who was the judge in the Starkweather case and unfortunately was also the judge in Carol's case, which is not something that would be done. 2 different judges should have handled that case, assigned local attorney John MacArthur as her attorney. He took the challenge on. The assumption from the judge was that MacArthur would do the minimum that he needed to do to get this case through the court system. Instead, MacArthur started studying things and actually came to believe that Carol Ann was being true in her statements that she was a hostage and was following Charlie's instructions so her family would not be injured. So Attorney MacArthur fully believed that. This book by MacArthur's grandson goes into why that was the case. So if you are curious about that side of the case, I recommend the book. However, this case was tried as much in the media as it was in the court. One of the tactics that MacArthur tried beforehand, before the trial actually began, was all the news coverage was very, very much anti-Carol. Carol did all of this. Carol needs to pay for all of this. And his experience dealing with Carol outside of the stressful environments of a court indicated that if she just were able to tell her side of the story in some capacity, that would work in her favor. So he arranged with Nanette Beaver, a KMTV television Omaha radio or television reporter, to be the person interviewing her. But the deal that they made was that all other media outlets could be in the same room watching and filming this, and if they had questions they wanted to have asked, they could write them down and pass them to Nanette, and Nanette would consider whether to ask them. Well, when you see the number of people that were in the room when they actually did that in a later slide, it was a circus. Carol Ann was put in front of a situation with dozens, if not hundreds, of news reporters. And so the somewhat shy girl, the somewhat reticent girl, the somewhat friendly girl became a hard, cold, hard as nails. That's the impression that most people got when they saw that press interview, which was all over the media. When they saw stills like this, where it looks like she's struggling with Gertrude Carnup, the wife of Sheriff Carnup, who was her guardian during this time. Carnup changed her testimony from when she had said something early, and so Carol Ann was frustrated because Carnup had changed what she said to something that was more harmful to Carol Ann. So all of these photos make her look like a petulant, cold, uncaring young girl who doesn't understand what's going on around her. And most of the people who knew her personally and dealt with her outside of stressful environments said that's not this girl at all, but you get what you get. MacArthur had a co-attorney. One of the weird things is that although Charlie was given the opportunity to have multiple attorneys working on his behalf, when MacArthur tried to get his partner to be authorized to be a co-defense counsel, the judge said, nope, you're it. One defense counsel, that's it. She doesn't get anything more than that. So her trial took a lot longer, had a lot more witnesses. I'm going to shortcut by not giving you a whole list of all of them because we don't have much time. But suffice it to say, the jurors went out, were gone for about the same amount of time. Actually, it took a little longer than the Starkweather case did. And they had the choice of multiple different designations. Same as Charlie, guilty in the first degree, guilty in the commission of another crime, the robbery. Not guilty at all. I mean, they could have said she indeed is telling the truth. She was a hostage. She did this all because somebody else was telling her to do that. That was an option. They could have chosen that. They came back with a lesser sentence or a lesser decision. Their decision was she was guilty in the assistance of the commission of murder while another crime was being committed, robbery, the $4. It was all the $4. She was sentenced to life imprisonment. Several of the jurors in advance of the trial and in interviews afterwards said, we all went in saying, we're never going to vote for this girl to be executed. But many of them also had the mindset as they went in that they were going to convict her no matter what. MacArthur tried to have the results thrown out later when a few weeks after that, one of the jurors was quoted in the newspaper as having placed a bet that Carol would get the death sentence as he's on the jury. He did to the media, he placed that bet, and that normally would be reason to throw out a result and have a mistrial and do it all over again. He was turned down. Every single opportunity to have a retrial of this case on Carol Ann's behalf was turned down for various reasons. Meanwhile, Charlie went through a couple of different appeals to his execution. He knew it was going to happen. His family was trying very hard to try to have it commuted so that it would be a life sentence, but that wasn't going to happen. And on June 25th, after a couple of stays at various different levels of the law system, he was rescheduled for basically midnight on June 25th. He was executed. His death certificate gives the explanation of electrocution by the state of Nebraska. He was the last person electrocuted in the state of Nebraska. After that, any further executions have been done by gas chamber. Meanwhile, multiple attempts to get new trials scheduled were all shot down from various different sources. John MacArthur, his partner, who was in that one little sketch, ends up passing away at one point, and he takes on his own son, James MacArthur, as a new partner, and the two of them continue pro bono without any fees whatsoever to serve as her attorneys for the next 18 years while she's incarcerated. She passes up every single opportunity she has to ask for parole. She wants a new trial to prove that she didn't do what she was accused of. So they continue to file things and continue to get shot down. Finally, the very last thing that she could possibly do to have is the U.S. Supreme Court. It was taken to the U.S. Supreme Court. James MacArthur pled his case in front of them, and they refused to hear it. And so it was tossed back to Nebraska. At that point, the only way she was going to get out of jail was to be paroled. So first there was a commutation hearing, which she had to go through 2 of those before her life sentence was commuted down to 30 to 50 years. And even the second one of those, when it was commuted, still kept her in jail for 3 more years until June 8th, 1976, where she appears before the parole board and is granted parole. As part of her parole, it was not made public that she requested this, but it was in the paperwork, and if you look at the paperwork, you can see this. She was told by the parole board that she could not have any interviews about this case for 5 years. She didn't want people pursuing her. She didn't want to talk about the case, so she said, make that part of the stipulation for my release, that I can't speak to anybody for 5 years. And so they did, and so she immediately moved. There had been a 1973 documentary, Growing Up in Prison, which was produced and shown on television, and a couple of people in Michigan who got to know her through that documentary had agreed that they would be her guardians, and so she moved immediately after she left prison to Michigan, a suburb of Lansing, where she began work as a nanny, and also worked as a custodian in a hospital. She had always wanted to be a nurse, and the closest she could get was being a custodian. In 2007, she married, so 31 years after her release, to a man, Fred Clare, in Michigan, and they moved to a smaller town than the one she had been living in. 7 years later, they were in a horrific traffic accident in which he was driving the SUV that they were driving in, which rolled over multiple times, and he was killed instantly. She suffered multiple injuries and has been recovering from that ever since then. She is still alive, and this is from last year when she advised on the filming of a documentary series which has since aired on the Showtime network called The 12th Victim, based in part on this book. Anybody who lived through that time period would be happy to tell you about the panic in Lincoln. It was the fact that the bodies were popping up in triplets in various places anywhere in town meant that anybody could be the next victim. So there was severe panic. The governor called out the National Guard after the Ward's bodies were found, but that was a little late because they were captured in Wyoming a day later, so that really didn't make a huge amount of difference. But there were National Guard jeeps and machine guns patrolling downtown. People were showing up with shotguns and handguns to get their kids at school. That is the press conference that was given with Carol Ann answering the questions. That's Carol Ann at the table at the front of the room with Nanette Beaver, the reporter from Omaha, who then produced the special Growing Up in Prison. 2 other major reporters. There were lots of reporters that were doing this, but locally, the guy on the left is Del Harding, a reporter for the Lincoln Journal and Star, and Marge Marlette, also a reporter. She went on to write dozens of articles over the years, including lots of articles about the psychology of juvenile delinquency and whether something like this could have been prevented. If you look in the headline Starkweather book, it reprints a whole series of articles that she wrote after the trials had taken place, quoting experts and talking about the state of juvenile delinquency in the city of Lincoln. One of the things the public was absolutely pissed off about was the fact that the cops didn't do anything. Look at all this happen. You didn't stop this. You didn't do enough. Well, despite the fact that internal evaluations exonerated the police and their actions, especially the fact that the police were out twice to the Bartlett home and didn't find 2 or 3 bodies in the outbuildings because they never looked in the outbuildings. The mayor and the chief of police called in outside consultants, and Harold Robinson, a former FBI agent, was brought in as an outside observer who interviewed everybody associated with the investigation to do an unbiased report to talk about whether the police did their jobs effectively. The public considered the results that he gave to be a complete whitewash and didn't believe a word of it, but his results indicated that the police did everything that was in their power to do at the time. There was no call for them to be checking things that the public thought, why didn't they find the bodies? He did offer some criticisms and some commendations So positives and negatives. He did give recommendations on how things could be done better in the future. If you look at the news coverage in the years subsequent to that, the local police didn't take any of his recommendations at all. It just got watered under the bridge. So, we're now down to the materials in the library collection, which I will race through. First of all, in the Heritage Room and in our reference collection on the second floor is are two books by Dr. James Reinhardt. One is The Murderous Trail of Charles Starkweather, and the other one, he actually did 4 books, but the other one that has a Starkweather section is The Psychology of Strange Killers, both of which take an incredibly dry and scientific approach to the psychology involved in what caused Starkweather to do what he did. There were about 30 hours worth of interviews that he conducted with Starkweather either before the trial or after the trial. Carol was written by Nanette Beaver, that Omaha reporter. It was the first book to come out with that treated Carol with a little bit more kid gloves. Most of the Starkweather books treat her as a full 100% partner in what happened, but Nanette had such a close relationship with Carol over years of talking to her and doing the documentary that she did do something which tried to be being a little bit more unbiased than some of the other reporters. The film, Badlands, 1974, starring Martin Sheen and Sissy Spacek, was very much a direct copy of the events of this time period, although the names were changed. And the locations, to South Dakota and the Badlands. Nonetheless, there are lines that come straight from the trial transcripts. So that is the closest match to this case in the entertainment industry. However, there have been a number of other films. In fact, Badlands wasn't the first one inspired by this case. The Sadist in 1963 was, and then multiple films since then. In chronological order, Wild at Heart, California, True Romance, Natural Born Killers, The Frighteners, and a movie actually called, in 2004, Starkweather, which bears such little resemblance to the reality of the case that I do not recommend viewing it. It's just not anything. One interesting point, The Frighteners is directed by Peter Jackson, who went on to the Lord of the Rings trilogy and deals with a couple of serial killers. The closest match after Badlands, there really isn't any other close ones. These are all just young couples murdering people on the run, essentially. Starkweather, The Story of a Mass Murderer is a book that we do have in the collection. It, as many of the other Starkweather books do, just treats everything Starkweather said as gospel and doesn't question any of it. And basically, when it makes statements of fact, you can attribute them or you can track them back to things that Starkweather specifically said without them doing any research to find out whether there's any corroborating sources that can be used. Bruce Springsteen, 1982, released the album, his 6th studio album called Nebraska. He had just read Carol and had been inspired by the events of that to write an album, and the multiple songs on this album all have references to things that can be attributed to this case. Oddly enough, that's such a popular album that the Poly Music Library downstairs has 2 books about the making of this album. So if you're curious, you can do some more research on your own. The quirky part of this, however, is that we do not own Nebraska as an album, even in our digital music collection. There was a play by Omaha playwright Doug Marr, which premiered at the Omaha Community Playhouse and subsequently had productions in Florence, a suburb north of Omaha, and here in Lincoln at the Joyo Theater. There it is, at the Joyo. Headline Starkweather we talked about. I do recommend it. After when I finally sat down and read it cover to cover, I was stunned at how biased it is. It is reprints of many of the articles, sometimes truncated, but it's also that Earl Dyer, former editor at the paper, with his own comments in between the articles, and it is just massively biased. It's crazy. But nonetheless, if you're looking for the articles, that's a good way to look at it. Another one that basically takes Starkweather at his word. 1983, 2-part TV miniseries on ABC called Murder in the Heartland with Tim Roth and Fairuza Balk. The producers of that made every attempt that they could to have it be an accurate adaptation, including talking to Carol's attorneys and getting their input to make sure that Carol was adapted in an accurate fashion as much as possible. However, some of the network brass farther up the food chain refused to let certain facts about the case be included. So for instance, Tim Roth did not have bow legs and did not walk like Charlie Starkweather did, and there were several other factual things that were not included. The producer of the miniseries came to Lincoln and was taken around by some locals to see some of the sites associated with it, and was introduced to people as I'm doing this thing. And without a question, he got no support for Carol whatsoever. Everybody was like, just like Charlie said, if he's going to be executed, she should be sitting in his lap at the time. That was the attitude of every single person this producer ran into in the city of Lincoln when he was here touring. And the person taking him on the tour is like, I'm sorry about that. And the guy was like, no, this is the reality. I need to see what people's attitudes are so that I can make the best possible movie I can. This book I do not recommend. It's awful. It is 2 essays. The first essay is basically a summation of the crimes and the trials. It also, from whole fabric, invents dialogue between characters that never happened. The second half, however, is not much better, but it is an essay about all the films inspired. So we saw the slide with all the covers of those DVDs. This one goes into great detail talking about the psychology of teen killers on the road and romance and whatnot. So it is interesting if you're especially a cinemaholic, but I do not recommend it from its factual point of view. Another one which bases its entire content on Starkweather's statements himself. The one from the attorney's grandson. Subsequent to that book coming out, which is a fairly thick book in and of itself, came a supplemental volume called The Fugate Files. This is reproductions of all the documentation that were in MacArthur's law offices on the case. So if you're at all interested, the library does not own this. I am recommending it for purchase for both the circulating and the Heritage Room collection because it is by a Nebraska author, but at this time we do not actually have the Fugate Files. However, if you go to the author's website, Jeff MacArthur, you will find that he has linked and actually embedded on his website the full-length documentary Growing Up in Prison. So if you're at all interested in watching that documentary, you can find it on his website. The 12th Victim was the most recent book out, 2014, by Ohio author and researcher Linda M. Battisti. She's also an attorney, and local attorney John Stevens Berry, which once again takes Carol's point of view and talks about all the things that, looking back in retrospect, were done incorrectly in the trial, and the changed testimonies and the things that over the years would no longer be allowed to have happen in a trial that were allowed to have happen back then. That was adapted into that Showtime miniseries that just aired in February, which is my next to the last slide. Finally, there's a brand new book coming out next month by Harry N. McLean, who grew up through his high school years here in Lincoln, Nebraska, and since moved on to jobs in various other places and currently lives in Denver. He came back and did a ton of additional research beyond what his personal recollections were, and so his book will be coming out in September. And while he was here, he went to the address where the Barton home would have been. Last but not least, resources available. We've already talked about this at the beginning. We have a list of all the books, a printable timeline, a printable index to our clipping files, links to recommended websites, and more, all in the Starkweather box. In addition, here in Lincoln, at History Nebraska, on the University of Nebraska's campus, you will find correspondence from one of the defense attorneys for Starkweather, a timeline of the Starkweather events, interview transcripts related to the case all the way up through the 1990s when the miniseries was being filmed, miscellaneous research documents, and most important, if you are really wanting to see the nuts and bolts, they have the full trial transcripts from both trials, which we do not have access to here. Oddly enough, the same website that is supposed to have a link or that does have a link to that documentary for author Jeff MacArthur, has a link to the first 100 pages of the trial transcripts, but it is a dead link. It no longer works. So, in summation, having reached the end of our presentation, this presentation is in memory of 11 lives that were lost Thank you for attending. It is 7:30, which was our scheduled stop time. It will take us 10 or 15 minutes minimum to tear things down, but if anybody has any really critical questions you'd like to ask, or if anybody would like to share a memory from that time period, if you were from the Lincoln area, yes, sir.
I worked for Capital Steel. You call them Capital Iron, I think. It was Capital Steel.
I think I called it a capital metal, yes, sorry.
And originally, when I went there in February '57, I had been a lookout in Montana on a fire lookout.
Mm-hmm.
And that was my third job after that. I was, never forget the day that we found out that Mr. Ward, his wife, and their maid were gone. It was sad.
And because the killings were so random, it's like you don't know what to expect. Yes?
Wow.
It wasn't just people in Lincoln. I'm from Lexington, and when my parents, my dad had traveled a lot, had a Saint Bernard, very gentle dog, but a big dog with a big voice, and my mom was home alone a lot, didn't like dogs in the house until this, and then my dad comes home and Delilah, that's the dog, was in the house, and that's because nobody knew where he was. So it wasn't just people in Lincoln who were extremely worried.
The reports trickled in from all over the state of Nebraska that every small town location that sold guns or ammunition sold out within hours after these reports started trickling.
My oldest son was only 6 months old at the time.
Oh, wow, wow.
I was a kid when this all happened, and Starkweather had been our garbage man, and he always made a mess whenever he picked up the garbage. My dad had had enough one day. He was a fireman, had to wear his uniform to work for some reason, and those uniforms looked a lot like the police uniforms. So he went out and confronted Charlie about this, and Starkweather cleaned it up and kind of slunk away. And when this all started happening, my mother was convinced he was coming for us. She was just sure that Dad had set something off. And I remember my neighbor picking us up in a big Consumer Electric panel truck, delivering kids to the door. I get home, my mother has a baseball bat and is near hysteria. There were people with guns roaming the streets downtown.
That was one of the
It's
concerns.
crazy.
The local police chief made a offhand comment that got turned into, it basically sort of mutated into what the public believed was an invitation for people to join a posse, essentially.
Yeah.
And so you had over 100 guys showing up with guns and rifles, saying, "What do you want us to do?"
They were down at the county jail back then.
Yep.
There were reports from police chief and the sheriff saying that they didn't want to turn these people away because this was just such a heightened moment, and they actually could use help if it worked out to be helpful, but they were concerned that over the course of the next couple of days there were going to be multiple deaths on the streets of Lincoln from people shooting people without provocation. So, and in fact, several people who resembled Charlie Starkweather in appearance
Oh, yes.
were in really bad straits. There
Yeah.
was one of the reporters for the Journal-Star who ended up racing into the offices of the Journal-Star, and his employers were like, "What are you doing? We need you out there getting in." He said, "Look at me." He had double parked in the street and wasn't even gonna go back out and move his car because he looked like Charlie Starkweather and had been chased through the streets by people. So,
Well, the Starkweather kids for years had a terrible time at school, just
Yeah.
simply because they were named Starkweather.
well, and the weird
Yeah.
part, not the weird part, the sad part is the Starkweather name was a proud name. Charlie's great-great-grandfather was a U.S. representative. One of the books describes the family as being downwardly mobile. From that point in the family's history, things went downhill. But there are cities named Starkweather. There are streets in cities named Starkweather.
Yeah.
Starkweather was an honorable name, and locally, it was tainted forever. So,
Yeah.
yes.
I think it's important to point out that part of the terror involved in this
was that he was the first spree killer.
Yes.
Nobody had any idea where he was gonna hit next. And, that really just terrorized everybody. He could go anywhere in the nation.
There have been serial killers and mass killers, but you're right, spree, where it just keeps popping up repeatedly, and it didn't follow the same pattern. There were guns, there were knives, it was all over the place with regards to that. The other thing is, it was in the era where the beginning of television news, I mean, the television had been around for a few years, but it wasn't really huge, but that, as more televisions had appeared in people's homes, the Bartlett home had just recently gotten a television for the first time. And they were low income, so that meant that people of slightly higher income probably had television before them, but that was suddenly a source of news. Lincoln was still primarily the print media, so newspapers, and the way that the coverage was done, if you look through our clippings collection, hey, from up the library, somebody accused the paper of sensationalizing it. And one of the editors at that point said, how can we sensationalize this? Look at what's happening. Nonetheless, if you look at the way it was reported, there's a lot of sensationalism in the coverage of this. Whether or not you want to accept Carol Ann's point of view and what her claims were, the way that the media covered it, she was brutalized in the media. There was no question to everybody in the media, she was just as guilty as Charlie. So whether or not she was, yeah.
To add to the Lexington, my mom, who's here, her parents, my grandparents lived about 14 miles just west of Hastings on Highway 6. So we had always been told that he took that route, but now I don't know if he went more
Do you
north or
remember?
not.
Do you remember the Showboat gas station? That's where he stopped for gas
Okay.
before turning back around to come
Okay.
back in and do the stuff at the Ward's house. So he made it that far and decided, no, we need to get another car, and Lincoln's gonna have more cars for us.
Well, it was very scary.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Any other comments or questions?
You know, for a number of years, and I'm sure my colleagues will remember this, Mrs. Ward's sister would call our reference desk and ask us to read certain clippings to her on the phone.
Wow.
And that was hard. I don't did that ever happen to you, Becky?
I did not get that, no.
Well, I don't know, maybe she started asking for me because she knew I would do it, but,
The Wards
yeah.
only had one child who at the time of the crimes was in a boarding school in Connecticut. He was a very young boy. He was flown back with a relative to attend the funerals and whatnot. I don't have any other information about what happened with him in the family home and whatnot, but I know that that was the case. He had a daughter. That daughter, Liza Ward, wrote a book called
Valentine.
Outside Valentine,
Outside Valentine.
which is roughly fictionalized some of the things that happened here. But she was one of the people who showed up for the last two hearings to speak on behalf of Carol Ann Fugate. She believed, based on the research she did to learn more about her parents, that Carol Ann was indeed not guilty, and so she wanted to be a voice to speak up and say, I believe that she should be either pardoned or given a new trial or something like that. So,
Since he was 14.
yeah.
Really.
Well, I have a friend who's a true crime fanatic and came into Lincoln several years ago, and we took her to all their sites. I gotta tell you, don't do that. The people who live at where the August Meyer farm is don't want you coming out anywhere near them. The people who live in the Ward house don't want you coming anywhere near them. People, if they see you going to the grave sites, and many of the gravestones for the victims and Charlie himself are publicly accessible in public cemeteries. If they see you there taking photos, they'll come over and ask you what you're doing, and why are you here, and why are you dredging this back up again for us? So.
Yeah.
There is a memorial plaque in the zoo over here to the Wards.
Oh, didn't know that. I'll have to take a photo of that. He says after telling me but suffice it to
I only
say,
lived to be 93 because I have a terrific memory. I didn't come up here until I was about 3 years old, south of Franklin, but I remember the dirt storms and going to the cellar to get out of. and a flood in 35 on the Republican River down there by Frankfurt. I forget nothing.
So we got about 5 more minutes. Any other questions that I can address?
The last book you showed here said the crime spree that changed America.
Mhm.
What was important in Nebraska? In what way did he see it changed America?
It was one of the first, you mentioned that it was one of the first spree killings. It was covered internationally. It spread from the events taking place in Lincoln and being publicized in Lincoln and Omaha to reporters from other countries arriving here in Lincoln to help cover this case. It was that widespread interest. It literally was the first crime of that type, especially by a teenager. It's one thing to have a
in a place where you really wouldn't expect it to
right,
happen.
in the bucolic heartland of America, hence the title of the TV movie, Murder in the Heartland. So there were lots of elements. There was an exploration in the media, but also behind the scenes, of the trend of juvenile delinquency. And whether this was something that needed to be concerned about. And a lot of papers were written and a lot of articles were published talking about how this was just one of the earliest signs that juvenile delinquents are a serious problem in our country. Whether that's true or not, I mean, nowadays you get complaints about people watching violent video games and turning into shooters and stuff like that, but nothing like this quite had happened, especially with teenagers. Now, with that in mind, my friend who's the true crime person, when I was talking to her a couple nights ago about this, I said that the rules have changed about whether Carol Ann at 14 should have been tried as an adult, and that technically really shouldn't have had it happen, but the judge refused to even consider doing it differently because there was such a public outcry. They were looking for blood. Whether or not that was legitimate, whether maybe she was guilty, but whatever the case, they wanted it out there in the public, and so the public could see that justice was done. But when I told my friend, well, 14 years old, that wouldn't happen now, and she said, oh yeah, well, and she pointed out several cases where kids that young have been tried as adults. So I went, and there is an interesting page on Wikipedia. If you look for the youngest killers ever who have been convicted of things, it's actually terrifying to see. Well, there are kids 6 and 7 years old who have been put on trial for murder. So it is not uncalled for that a 14-year-old, even in today's culture, might not be tried as an adult, but back then, that was close to unheard of. So the fact that it is manipulated that way. Oh yes, and it had a lot of cultural impact. There are people, and Becky just showed me a reminder, it inspired Stephen King. Stephen King became a writer in part because of this case. He was a kid at the time that this was happening, and he was terrified. If that could happen in Lincoln, Nebraska, and before he actually got captured, Charlie could show up anywhere. He could show up in Des Moines. He could show up in Chicago and kill people. Well, he could show up in Maine, where King was living. But that made such an impact on Stephen King that in subsequent novels of his, he's named characters. He's basically had multiple characters in his works inspired by Charlie Starkweather and Carol Ann Fugit. So it had changed the world. I don't know, but it had an impact far beyond Lincoln, Nebraska. And I am curious to see that book when it comes out next month and see what he wants to say about that. But it's sad. It's incredibly sad. It's something that horrific is one of the biggest stories to come out of my hometown. But it is. I mean,
The library
I
will be
had
closing
people
in 20
comment,
minutes.
why are you dredging this up? Why are you putting survivors, people who moved people through this
The
thing
library will be open
again?
tomorrow at 10
And I
a.m.
understand that.
Thank you.
But at the same time, it's one of the most important historical events that took place in Lincoln. No matter how horrific it is, it's something that people should be aware of. Maybe they don't want to think about it, but it's still something that shouldn't just be shoved under the rug. You need to be aware that this can happen even in your hometown. Anyway, it is closing in on quarter till. I thank you all for attending. If you ever see me and want to ask more questions, come back and talk.